Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for the delay. We're going to call this meeting to order. And if we could please start with the clerk issuing the oath of office.
Great, thank you. Betsy Anderson from Piedmont, from City of Piedmont. If you could repeat after me. I, Betsy Anderson, do solemnly swear
I, Betsy Anderson, do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California.
that I take this obligation freely
That I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I'm about to enter.
And I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you. We're going to go ahead and start with the roll call, please.
Yes, thank you. Alameda County,
Present.
Albany, Berkeley,
Present.
Dublin,
Yes.
Emeryville,
Present.
Fremont,
Present.
Livermore, Newark,
Present.
Oakland, Piedmont,
Present.
San Leandro, Tracy.
Here.
Union City.
Here.
Community Advisory Committee,
Present.
Hayward,
Present.
Pleasanton.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, clerk. And before we get started, I just want to announce that we do have members participating from various locations, which is listed on our agenda. We have individuals at the Berkeley City Hall, City Council Conference Room in Pleasanton, Scott Haggerty Heritage House, and someone in Texas, and the Lending Library in Milwaukee. So thank you for listing this in the agenda. And I'm going to ask Director Patino to please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible.
Thank you. I'm now going to open up public comment. This is your opportunity to weigh in on items that are not on today's agenda, but under the purview of East Bay Community Energy. Do we have any public comments?
Yes, we have received a public comment request from Audrey Ichinose.
Okay.
Audrey Ichinose, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
There you go. Okay, now I'm sure you can hear me. Audrey Ichinose is my name. I'm a resident of South Berkeley on the Berkeley-Oakland border. I'm a longtime member of the East Bay Clean Power Alliance, one of the many organizations and individuals that helped to bring EBCE into existence with strong labor support. I often attend the Community Advisory Committee meetings. A few days ago, Tom Kelly sent each of you a document that listed EBCE's major goals under the JPA signed by all member jurisdictions. He focused on the goal of providing electricity that was lower in GHG content than PG&E's default product. I want to remind board members of another goal of the JPA, which is the development of local clean energy assets. Both goals need to be kept in mind. They are part of the backdrop to today's session on power procurement. The goal of clean energy development, local clean energy development, is reiterated in EBCE's Local Development Business Plan, which the board adopted in 2018 as full operations commenced. Since then, after nearly 5 years of operation, and after achieving strong financial stability as an electricity retailer, We can and need to ask how EBCE is doing on this front too. It's not only, quote, local clean energy development that's involved. The pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, and many other unforeseen occurrences that brought urgently to the fore the social and environmental justice goals that are inherent in local development. In view of this wider context in which power procurement decisions are made, I hope that EBCE will schedule another special board retreat like this one on the question of how much it has accomplished so far on local development. We would all benefit from an overview of EBC's actions in this area, and of course, quantitative data. But an overview should include not just a list of projects and programs, but also how much this investment represents relative to EBCE's annual budget and surplus allocations. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Do we have any more public comments?
There's no further public comment.
Okay, thank you. And we'll acknowledge, I believe we all received the email communication for Mr. Tom Kelly. We'll close public comment and now move on to item number 4, power procurement updates. And we're going to receive a presentation. We have the deck in our packets. And who will be kicking us off?
Hi, my name is Marie Fontenot. I'm the Vice President of Power Resources at EBCE, and I'll kick us off, but then a few members of the Power Resources team will be the primary speakers today. Next slide, please, Adrian. As I mentioned, a few members of the Power Resources team will be speaking today. I'll be giving you an introduction on who the team members are and a high level of what their roles are. Then we'll be talking about what is the California energy market and how it relates to other energy or compares to other energy markets across the country. We'll give you an overview of some of our key compliance obligations. We have lots of compliance obligations. We're just going to focus on a couple of the really important ones. And then we'll talk about how we are building a portfolio of clean energy resources to meet our emissions reductions goals. And then we'll talk about how we manage our long-term contracts and our long-term assets and the work and complexity associated with that. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we're a team of 10 people. Our most recent 2 members, Shannon and Jason, we don't have photos of them yet. They're so new. But yeah, there's 10 people on our team. As I mentioned, I lead the team. Jim Dorrance is our manager of long-term contracts and settlements. Chris is our director of energy analytics and short-term energy supply. Karen Lee manages our resource adequacy portfolio, and she'll be speaking about what is resource adequacy, or RA, as you've already heard me say in recent board meetings a number of times. Izzy Carson manages our renewable energy portfolio and transactions and our carbon-free energy transactions. And she'll be giving you an overview of why renewable energy and carbon-free energy are not the same thing. So the 5 of us will be speaking today. The rest of the team might be attending, but will not be in a speaking role. Ray Dye is our manager of energy market risk and counterparty risk. Alan Sieber is our portfolio management analyst. And it's sort of a jack of all trades. He's learning about all of the different products that we transact. Matt Chiodo is our contract management analyst. Shannon Rivers works on virtual power plants. She works on making sure that that behind the meter projects, things that are, like Tesla power walls in people's houses, that we can try to aggregate those things that are in our service territory and make sure that they are delivering value to EBCE in the energy market. It's a really emerging space in energy. And last but not least, Jason Zhang is our newest team member, and he is another analyst in our team, and he's specifically working on improving our dashboards and our analytical, our speed of performing different analyses and better visualizations into our portfolio. Okay, next slide, please. So what do? We do a lot of different things. We transact all of the energy. We make sure we own the majority of compliance for EBCE. We have a slide coming up that lists out all of our compliance requirements. We negotiate new long-term contracts and manage them once they've been executed. I already mentioned transacting renewable energy and carbon-free energy, but yeah, this is just sort of a high-level overview of all of the weird, weedy things that your power resources team is working on that you'd never know about unless you sat through this presentation. Next slide. Okay, over to Jim. Oh, I'm sorry. One more thing. I apologize for not mentioning this. So we have about an hour and 45 minutes left at this point. That we have time built in for questions, and so I'd just like to encourage board members to raise your hands and ask questions throughout the presentation. If I get a sense that we're going to be running out of time, I might ask to hold questions at different points. But in general, please feel free to ask questions as they come to you. And I see one now from board member Halbert.
Yes, thank you, Marie. Question I have is around billing and feedback I've gotten from some consumers who don't understand. They think they're being billed twice, once from PG&E and once from East Bay Community Energy. And so if they have a question about their bill, the dispute resolution, do they call PG&E? Does PG&E work on it, fix it, or not? Then the other question I have is, because I've had people with very low income calling and distressed because they have like very low income and their energy costs are skyrocketing, which they are for everybody. And it's not our fault. It's, I guess, more of a market thing. It's been cold and energy is costly. So they're using more than they did before, and it's costly. But how do we have programs for them? And should they be asking PG&E to give them assistance, or do we have a program that provides very low, and I'm talking about a wheelchair bound SSI, very, very, very low income person in particular, although I've had calls from others. How do I direct them?
We do have programs for low income individuals. And I think that the best thing to do would be for me to follow up with you, or perhaps share this information at the next board meeting so that it's made available to the entire board. Our marketing and account services team actually is responsible for billing and for the low income programs. And so I can speak to the fact that we do have low income programs. I am not an expert in them though. And so I'll ask that Annie Henderson prepare something for the next board meeting, which is a week from today.
Great. If they could follow up with me as well, that would be wonderful. I note that when we put the program in place, and I was mayor at the time, we went with a opt-out option, which means you were all in unless you opted out. And so that's why I figure most people are just, all in still. So anyway, that's really good to know. We're taking charge of that. Thank you.
Member Bartlett, I see a question.
Oh, great. Thank you. I just want to follow up because I've also had many calls from constituents about energy relief in these cold times. And I'm wondering if maybe instead of waiting for the next board meeting, can you just email us something that we can share with the community?
Sure, absolutely. We'll get on that.
A phone number and a website and a rights information. Okay.
Will do.
Thank you.
I'm going to chime in here. I want to make sure we stay focused on the agenda item. I appreciate all the questions, but we only have a limited amount of time and we have a lot of deck slides to get through. So at the end, if we have time for questions not pertaining to today's topic, we could take that up, but we have a lot of content to get through. So go ahead and proceed. Thank you, Marie.
Okay, thank you. Jim?
Yeah, thanks. Good. Everyone can hear me okay? Sounds like
Yeah.
it. Excellent.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Again, we're here to talk about the power we buy, but before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about where we operate in, and that's the California energy landscape and also the broader regional power landscape as well. Next slide, please. So North American Balancing Authority areas. So we are in California here, California ISO, but there are other similar entities across the US. These are a combination of independent system operators, ISOs, and regional transmission organizations, which are called RTOs. So these are balancing authorities, and the role of these entities, just like the California ISO to the left, is to operate their respective transmission grids. These entities operate under some pretty broad regulatory framework, and I'll go a little bit in the weeds here, but the standards for these entities themselves are issued by the Northern American Reliability Corporation, which is NERC, but that these regulations are approved by FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And I do this because we do a lot of acronym talk here, and I just want to make sure that people are clear on kind of what the background is. This stuff is pretty far in the weeds, but this is kind of the framework of what the CalISO operates in as a balancing authority. Next slide, please. So then specific to our balancing authority, the California Independent System Operator, the CalISO. It's here on the map in the purple, denoted as CalISO, pretty clear there. Again, we're a balancing authority. It operates the grid in the state and the generation resources within it. Some general facts about the CalISO. It has an average peak load, and so peak load is demand, which is the usage of energy at a point in time. It's usually denoted almost always as megawatts, but it can be smaller as well, gigawatts and kilowatts. The 5-year average for demand in the CalISO is 47,000 megawatts. And last year there was a pretty large peak, which could be indicative of the direction where we're going. And that was 52,000 megawatts as well. Again, it's a balancing authority. They run the wires and the transmission grid in the state, and they have about approximately 26,000 circuit miles of transmission within the CalISO. So again, it's a balancing authority. It's called the CalISO, and that's California Independent System Operator. Some more information about the CalISO. It's the only independent grid operator in the Western United States. Well, what does this mean? It means it has no financial interest in the market, and really that allows them to kind of operate the generation resources with no kind of skin in the game for those units. They purely operate independently. And this creates a mean for balancing both the generation with the need and the usage. So you have assets that produce electricity and you have demand from households. And their role is to balance these in a way that can keep the energy prices low by being competitive, but also allow for the market to host a diverse set of resources that can participate in it as well. I'm still talking on this one, so don't skip yet. So the map to the right, again, we see the CalISO, but we also see a bunch of blue on there as well. So this is a kind of showing the other Western utility entities that can participate within the market that the CalISO hosts. What this does is creates a broader access for a larger diversity of generation resources. And so you think about, the California ISO has to balance the load in the state, but if we expand the reach of generation assets to further within the West, then we get, again, a greater diversity of resource that can be used in the state to then potentially offset gas with renewable and low emission sources, more so than can be hosted within the CalISO itself. Anna Olivia, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you. Does that do anything to decision making? I know one of the big issues that we've had in the past in looking at kind of regional integration is that the values of California and the values of some of the other states that I see highlighted there regarding the environment or energy generation may differ. And so I'm just wondering if their active participation or planned entry if that affects decision making at all.
Well, I don't know if I can give a great answer to this, and I might call a friend on this, but ultimately it's a competitive marketplace. So they will put their resources in, and if the CalISO deems it through their market optimization that the generation fits with the load profile, then they'd be awarded purely based on economics to keep the price of the power in the state relatively low.
Can I add
was
just
helpful.
2 clarifying points? So as a California load serving entity, EBCE is subject to the California Public Utilities Commission's jurisdiction, not for rate setting, but for compliance and ensuring that we are reliable and that we're meeting most of our compliance obligations. And so, you know, California has a renewable portfolio standard. Utah does not. So Utah participating in the energy imbalance market to a limited extent that it does, that has nothing to do, it has no impact on our compliance obligations because most of them come from the Public Utilities Commission. And then way back when in like 2014, 2015, when the energy imbalance market was first being developed, the difference between California's preference for carbon-free energy and the rest of the West, at that time, it was really, nobody cared about carbon-free energy. There's been progress even in Utah since then. But there was actually a component to pricing that was created where in for a megawatt of energy produced in Utah, maybe with a coal plant, the price would appear as one number, and California would see that price differently. It actually had an emissions adder that appears to the California entities because we don't like the emissions, but does not appear to the Utah entities. So there's a slight difference in how participants in the market see the numbers based on if you're in California and if you're outside of it.
That was really, really helpful. So there could be an impact on what system power, like what is included in system power and the CO2.
Our system power right now is only the purple CAISO system power.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
it gets metered and counted one way. And so yeah, system power is just what's in the purple.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yep. And I'll just ask, if you would mind taking your hands down, Member Bartlett and Member Eldred, that would be great. Just so that we know when you ask any later questions. Jim, please continue.
So what does the CAISO do? It's this big purple area, but there's a couple of key tenets of the things that they do. I'm going to go out of order here, but the first is reliability. It maintains reliability in the state. It keeps the lights on and it keeps the power at the correct frequency that things plugged in can work. And so they operate the grid in a way to make sure that the power is on. That's a big deal. At the same time, it hosts a competitive market where generation and supply are matched or balanced. And they do this on the day ahead. So the day before, a bunch of people submit generation into the market and demand is matched as well. And they say, okay, here's the supply and here's the power that we're going to use on the day ahead. And then of course it manages future planning and development. How do we get more renewable in the state? How do we get more batteries in some of the locations here where it's needed? How do we build to expect more generation from out of state as well? And so they're continually planning and developing to optimize the grid and to allow the state to meet the renewable and emission targets that it has planned. Next slide. Okay, so we talked about the CAISO market a little bit. So the CAISO, again, reliability and a competitive market. It operates two distinct markets, the day-ahead market, which is the one on the top, and the real-time market. The goal of both is to, again, balance the demand with the lowest cost energy at all of the price nodes within the CAISO. And so a price node is a local location where an energy price is determined based on the market. And so buying energy in Northern California will cost you different than buying energy down in Los Angeles. And so their market sets those price points based on the generation put into it and the expected demand to come out. There's about 10,000, I think there's 9,700 of these price nodes in the CAISO. So there's a lot of price diversity along the state that the market optimization puts out. And so the day ahead market, it is what it sounds like. The bids are entered in on the day ahead and the schedule is set for the demand and the matching supply based on the forecast for the next day. So then the next day actual starts, and that's when the real-time market kicks in. And this is similar to the day ahead market, except it happens in real time. And this is in both 15 and 5-minute intervals. And this will balance the actual supply and demand in real time. And so the day ahead deals with forecasts for energy usage and the expectation of generation from the units. And then that is balanced in the real-time markets to ensure that there's adequate generation that can cover the actual real-time demand. So again, just overall, the goals of these markets are to both balance supply with the energy needs, again, the term demand, at efficiently and at the lowest cost as possible. That is the fundamental part of the CalISO market. That's all on the CalISO. So I'm going to pause and see if anyone wants to add anything on our team, stuff I might have missed. All right, next slide.
Hi, my name is Karen Lee, and I'll be discussing EBCE's compliance along with Izzy Carson. Next slide, please. So on the left here, you can find the dozens of compliance deliverables that the Power Resources team is responsible for. These vary from monthly, bi-monthly to annual. On the right, we wanted to highlight EBCE's commitments. So this is on top of what we are obligated to do, which is again, the compliance items on the left. As you can see, EBCE has our own commitments in relation to renewable procurement, emissions, and affordability. And Izzy Carson will actually go over these in more detail later on. Next slide, please. Thanks. So I wanted to focus on CPUC and CEC. So the California Independent System Operator, the CAISO, Jim just went over that in detail. The CPUC is the California Public Utilities Commission. And as Marie mentioned previously, EBCE is CPUC jurisdictional. Most of the compliance deliverables from the last slide are related to the CPUC. I also wanted to discuss the California Energy Commission, which is focused on resource conservation and ensuring reliability. They also prepare a number of reports on how California is using energy and where that energy comes from. Next slide. Great, so now we can dive into resource adequacy, or RA. This is a compliance product managed both by the CPUC and CAISO to make sure that load-serving entities like EBCE are contributing to overall system reliability. RA is purchased bilaterally as available capacity or megawatts per month. So what are we obligated to do? So in each month, EBCE's RA obligation is determined by our peak demand plus a reserve margin. In previous years, the reserve margin was 15%. In 2023, it was increased to 16%, and for 24, it'll likely be 17%. So currently, there is a trend of increasing that planning reserve margin or buffer. In regards to compliance, we demonstrate our compliance to both the PUC and CAISO on a year ahead basis and a month ahead basis. And in this example system RA requirement, you can see how, there's seasonal trends to overall demand across California, with July, August, and September being the highest, and September especially being the highest and kind of the months that the state regulators are most worried about. All right, next slide. Thanks. So currently in our RA compliance, we have two requirements. One is the system RA, one is flexible RA. System RA, the majority of resources we use to achieve our system RA compliance are interconnected to CAISO. I did want to flag that there is opportunity to utilize energy and resources from outside the CAISO that are imported in, and those have to follow very specific CPUC rules for imports. Within that system obligation, a portion of those resources must be flexible. Flexible means that they are able to ramp or increase output during hours of quote unquote flexible need. The most typical flex resources are peaker gas plants and battery storage resources. Finally, I wanted to note that in previous compliance years, EBCE did have a local RA requirement, but starting this compliance year, there is a central procurement entity that is responsible for procuring local RA, so we no longer have that requirement. Next slide. All right, I think this slide is really important because, you know, as California transitions to a more renewable grid, how do those resources contribute to system reliability? For, you know, the traditional gas generating resources, they typically contribute their nameplate capacity amount in megawatts as RA. However, we know that, you know, the sun is not always shining. You know, there's different times where there's more wind and less wind. So we can't really do the same for renewable or intermittent resources. However, they do still have a contribution to reliability. So the state has modeled the contribution of solar and wind using ELCC, or effective load carrying capability, which is really the effective contribution of those solar and wind resources. As you can see in these charts, in any month, the contribution is much lower than 100% of that resource's nameplate capacity. So for example, for a 100 megawatt solar project, the RA credit we get is between 0 and 15%, depending on the month. For a 100 megawatt wind project, the RA credit we get is between 10 and 40%, depending on the month. I also wanted to highlight the decreasing ELCCs. So when you compare the credit we were getting in 2020 versus the credit we're getting in 2023, generally there's been a decline. For wind, the 2023 values are decreased in spring and summer. They do increase a little bit in winter. For solar, the 2023 values decrease in all months except October, November, and December. You can see there's a really big drop in June, July, and August, all of which are capacity constrained months. So this is something, you know, that we're likely to see as more solar is built.
Karen, can I interrupt for just 1 second? And then I'd like to take Member Gonzalez's question. I want to just repeat what you said because it's really important. And let's use a real life example. EBCE's Scott Haggerty Wind Energy Center is a 57.5 megawatt wind farm in the Altamont. We never, ever get 57.5 megawatts of resource adequacy value from that resource. The most we can get is what? About 25% of 57.5, so 12, 115-ish megawatts. Our Rosamond, or excuse me, Golden Field solar project is 112 megawatts of solar. In January, it counts for 0 resource adequacy. So it is impossible to have a resource adequacy portfolio that is exclusively made of renewable resources. Well, it's definitely impossible to do it entirely with solar because it counts for 0 in January, and it would take huge amounts of renewable resources, and that's where energy storage is really valuable. And we do transact for resource adequacy from gas plants. I see Member Gonzalez took his hand down.
That was, I just wanted a real example and you did that, so thank you.
Okay, great. Member Eldred, did you have a question?
How do things like demand response and things like that play into that, or is that covered in a different slide?
It's not covered in a different slide. Demand response does count on a 1-for-1 basis, but we are capped at how much demand response we can use. Actually, I misspoke. It's not truly 1-for-1. There is a special counting mechanism that the CPUC came up with that we have to use. I think it's pretty close to 1-for-1 though, but we're capped. We can only, Karen, keep me honest, is it 14% of our monthly?
It's closer to 7%.
That's even worse. So we can't use a lot of demand response.
7% is more than 0.
Sure.
All right, thanks so much. That was helpful.
And the members in Pleasanton?
Yeah, so Member Balch, I just wanted to ask you, when we're talking about the decline in efficiency or the ability to count towards resource adequacy, why is that such a dramatic fall off, from the megawatts or the expected? What is accounting for that degradation of ability to count it?
The Public Utilities Commission, in concert with a lot of consultants, has found that back many years ago when the state was mostly gas plants and a little bit of renewable energy, you could really count on the renewable energy to be reliable when it only had to provide to sort of be there a little bit. But as we move to a primarily renewable generation system, its ability to be counted on in a consistent way when we're talking about the whole state is not as reliable when it's a larger portion of the generation mix. I think I can best speak to this through an example. There's not a ton of solar plants in the Bay Area because it's foggy and cloudy here a lot. So you have a lot of solar plants, the big utility scale solar in the Central Valley. But when storms come into the Central Valley, they can pretty easily cover up the entire Central Valley. And so if you have, if solar is 50% of the grid, it's not, but if it was 50% of the grid and 80% of that solar gets covered up by a storm system, that's not going to contribute to reliability. And so through these different studies, the Public Utilities Commission decided that because we want reliable electricity, that the value of these things to contribute to our reliability counting program had to be decreased. And it continues to be decreased in the coming years. It could be increased in the future as more and more storage comes online. But actually, Karen will be speaking to some changes that are coming to the RA landscape, I think in the next slide.
Okay, quick follow-up if I may then. These values of adequacy or resource adequacy that we're allowed to count on are prescribed to us by okay, so we cannot per se look at our energy portfolio and where it's located if it could beat the average, for example. That doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It's one set of numbers that is applied to all CPUC jurisdictional entities.
Okay, thank you very much.
Karen, would you continue?
Yeah, let's move on to the next slide. I think this will also address the declining ELCC question. So we wanted to focus here on RA reform and slice of day. So RA reform is undergoing at the CPUC level. The intent is to minimize cost, meet hourly reliability needs, and be adaptable to changing grid. And so what that means is previously we assumed that if we procured to the hour of greatest need in any month, then we would meet the reliability requirements in all other hours. And so when, there weren't a lot of renewables online, I think this approach just generally worked. However, now, due to a changing grid and increased renewable penetration, satisfying the hour of greatest demand doesn't necessarily mean that the demand in all other hours are met. So for example, before, the peak hour was generally in the middle of the day, and now due to a lot of behind the meter solar, it's shifted to those evening hours, generally hour 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. And you can see here that not only is that kind of 8 p.m. hour, an hour with great need, but also midnight and also 7 a.m. So again, currently we have a single system RA obligation and a single flex RA obligation every month. And the CPUC is proposing to change this to a framework where we have an hourly obligation each month. And so we would have to meet whatever obligation they assign us for all 24 hours of each month. So things are about to get a lot more complicated. Oh, Juan?
Just quickly, that obligation will be essentially hourly, the hourly for an average month, hourly by day, anticipated day, hourly. So just hourly in what way?
Yeah, great question. So likely the CEC and CPUC will look at, the CAISO load for the quote unquote worst day of each month. So the month with, the day with the highest peak demand. And then they'll look at each load serving entity's share, how they're contributing to that worst day. So, just as an example, EBCE is about 3% of the CAISO load. They would look at on that worst day, how we're contributing in each hour. And then they would assign us an obligation for every hour. So if this is, July, we would have an obligation for 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., all the way to midnight. Great, I think we can, yeah. Next slide, please. So we also wanted to discuss 3 procurement orders that have been issued by the Public Utilities Commission. The CPUC has recognized a need for new clean resources to come online and to support summer reliability. So in the past few years, we've seen 3 orders come out. There's the near term, the midterm, and the supplemental midterm. One thing to note is we're really focused on incremental resources, so new resources, and clean procurement. So solar, wind, storage, any kind of combination of solar plus storage, also geothermal and demand response. In this table, you'll find the overall procurement being assigned to all load serving entities and EBCE's portion of that, which yeah, is in the third row. I also wanted to note that the total procurement megawatts of NQC, that refers to net qualifying capacity, and it doesn't, again, equal the actual installed capacity. So similar to the ELCC framework, if we had a 200 megawatt solar project coming online next year in 2024, it would actually only count for 13 megawatts of our obligation. So, even if we see that 99 megawatts for 21 to 23, we actually are procuring much more of installed capacity. Similarly, for battery storage, if we have a 100 megawatt 4-hour duration battery coming online in 2025, it would count for 90 megawatts. So it has a much higher contribution than solar, but it still has a D rate. All right, next slide. And I will pass it over to my colleague, Izzy Carson.
Thanks, Karen. Excuse me. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so start with the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS. This is one of our bigger compliance obligations, so I wanted to go over this in a little bit more detail here, but it's a key program for advancing renewable energy. Most states, it's close to 40, have RPS policies in place, but those programs vary significantly in terms of structure and enforcement. No two states have the same programs in place. So California has set escalating renewable energy procurement requirements. You'll see those escalating percentages in that table below, kind of reflecting that. And this generation must be from RPS eligible facilities. So you'll also see that those compliance periods are grouped together over several years. So currently we are in compliance period 4, or CP4, down there at the bottom. But targets are verified on a multi-year compliance period rather than annually. So there's no single year requirement, but at the end of that compliance period, you need to have purchased the average percent across that period. I do also want to note that these are California RPS percentage targets. EBCE has renewable targets that are significantly higher than these minimum state requirements. We're committed to a zero emission portfolio with 80% renewables for all customers by 2030. And these in the table here are really just those minimum state requirements. Next slide. So how do we meet these compliance obligations? We use renewable energy credits, or RECs, and these are classified into portfolio content categories, or PCCs, to meet compliance. Renewable energy credit represents the clean energy attribute of renewable electricity. So one REC is equivalent to 1 megawatt hour of renewable electricity generated. These are classified into three distinct categories, or portfolio content categories, PCCs. And there's limitations to the amount that each group can count towards our renewable portfolio standard requirements. So portfolio content category 1, or PCC 1s, are considered bundled. These are from a renewable resource where the energy and the renewable energy credit are delivered together. They're from the same source. Portfolio content category 2, or PCC 2, also comes from renewable resources, but they're generated out of state where that energy is used locally. And then the REC is bundled with substitute energy that's not from the same source, but could also be renewable, and then delivered at the same time in California. And then PCC, or portfolio content category 3 RECs, don't have any of that underlying energy attached to the product. It's just the REC. So kind of high level, a PCC 1 comes from, say you have a solar facility in California, the energy is generated with the renewable energy certificate. Those are delivered together. PCC 2, you have a solar facility maybe in Oregon, just across the border. That energy is used locally. The renewable energy credit is paired with substitute energy, and then it's delivered together at the same time. And then that PCC 3 doesn't have the underlying energy attached at all. So next slide. So this slide is really just to help differentiate between RPS compliance and power content, which is a related but different requirement that we have to disclose the mix of sources used to provide electricity. So the power content label, it resembles a nutrition label. It's essentially a summary of a very detailed filing that we also have to do called the Power Source Disclosure Report. And that report shows every renewable energy credit, every megawatt hour procured from every resource over a calendar year. And it's rolled up into the summary that resembles nutrition label. And so kind of high level, what you have here is that the RPS program says you have to procure a specified percent of renewable energy. And the power content says that of that renewable energy that you've procured, X percent came from solar, X percent came from wind, et cetera. So it takes it to another level. Next slide, please. So this slide is really showing our renewable procurement targets as a percent of our retail sales through 2030. This is really our path to zero emissions. Slide breaks out the composition of our portfolio, shows short-term and long-term renewables, hydro, and the additional procurement that's necessary to meet our target of 100% carbon-free by 2030. It's again important to highlight that EBCE has a board-adopted schedule for this path to zero emissions electricity by 2030. You can see in this slide kind of what we have contracted to date, and then what we need to procure additionally in that kind of peach-colored to meet that target.
Can we pause and take Member Hobbart's question?
Sure.
Yeah, this is great, and I absolutely support the move to carbon-free. I guess my question is, what is the maximum number of megawatts that we can handle capacity-wise, and will it withstand what I call a mega event, which is when we start to have, every car be an electric car, and start to have every stove and water heater and air conditioner run on, well, I guess air conditioning is electric anyway, but the furnaces that heat our homes and heat our water, we're going to change those all to electric because of the benefits that we need to get to save the environment. But it feels to me, are we going to triple our energy megawatt usage, quadruple it, 10 times it? I don't know. But can we even buy that much power? Does it even exist? And if we do, and we buy it from out of state, when they start to go all electric, and then they can't sell us electricity anymore, maybe, what will we do then? And so my question is really on overall capacity, and what will it be when we get to the stage that we're going to make changes in the next, I don't know how long it's going to take to go all electric for all of our appliances and all of our cars, but it's coming in the next 30 years.
Yeah, it's what you're asking is a really insightful question, and it's something that we are constantly reevaluating. So is there enough renewable energy available to California for the entire state to be all renewable right now? No, but we're always out looking for new projects, signing new contracts, and we are the Power Resources team, our data and analytics team, and our local programs team are constantly reevaluating what is our demand. Like the local programs team is doing a lot of work to electrify cooktops and to electrify transportation, and so that it's an ongoing effort to study how much demand we are going to have in the coming years. And so we update our assumptions regularly and build that into our forecast of how much renewable or emissions-free energy we need to procure. And this is a process that we will be doing on an ongoing basis, basically from now into eternity. So a few months ago, the board approved our biannual, every other year integrated resource plan filing with the Public Utilities Commission, where we had a certain set of assumptions about electrification and how that would increase our demand. But it didn't have Stockton in our demand because it what we had to file was before Stockton had voted to join EBCE. So now we've done some supplemental analysis, and we have a revised view of what our demand will be going out 10 years and how that will be impacted by electrification. And so that is something that we will be talking about with the board on an ongoing basis. And
Thank you.
continuing to buy more and more resources to cover.
If we don't have enough renewable, do we just go turn back on the less renewable or non-renewable sources in order to keep our cars charged?
We don't have enough renewables today, but we're changing the grid. So the gas plants are going to come offline, and we need more renewables and other forms of emerging technologies that are clean to build out a clean grid.
Good. All right. Thank you.
Sorry, Izzy, please continue.
Okay, yeah. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here we have EBCE's 2021 power content label. So you can see here how this resembles that nutrition label that I mentioned. It shows the emissions factor by product for the calendar year 2021 on that top left. And then we also have the content from each of our plans by resource as a % of total retail sales on the right. So again, this is the annual requirement. If we compared this particular power content label from to the prior year, you'd see that the Bright Choice emissions went down and the renewable content went up. Again, we have this board, EBC has a board adopted schedule for the annual reductions in Bright Choice, and this is in line with that schedule. So I want to talk a little bit about the emissions factor that's being reported. I think it's important to clarify a little bit what that number represents and how that's changed in recent years and what it's showing. So that's again that top number on the left under that Bright Choice. And there's really two things that are driving that emissions factor. One is that in 2020, California changed its emissions accounting standards from sort of a global methodology to a California-specific methodology. So, a few slides back, we talked about those PCC2 RECs, and EBC does purchase a portion of our renewables as these PCC2 RECs. Again, these are a renewable product that are counted as renewable under the RPS program. They are by and large solar, wind, and hydro resources. They're generated outside of California. So there's clean energy being generated and there's emissions being reduced. It's just that those emissions are being reduced in another state. And because of that, under this California-specific methodology, the new accounting adds an emission factor to these resources. So yes, the out-of-state numbers, mostly those PCC2s do put an emissions burden on that program, but at the same time, we've established pretty robust targets to ensure that our plan has less emissions over time and headed towards that 2030 target. The second piece that contributes to that is really that EBC does not take the allocation of nuclear. And so that emissions number is a reflection of the trade-off between having nuclear and lower greenhouse gas emissions and not having nuclear and accepting higher greenhouse gas emissions due to buying a portion of our energy from the market where you get this average emissions factor. See, it looks like there's a couple of questions.
Member Eldred, would you like to go first?
I'm happy to wait for Pleasanton to go first.
Okay, member who?
I think it's me. She just gets the camera. So Member Balch, a quick question on the PCC2s, right? So if we were to evaluate the number you're saying again, I'm kind of asking, is it a prescribed number because the emissions are generated in another state? So if we were to look at that, that is prescribed, I presume, due to transmission. Factoring that out, does Bright Choice do better?
Yes, factoring it out. Sorry, echo. Yeah, factoring it out, Bright Choice definitely does do better. The PCC2s are hit with an emissions factor that's equal to unspecified power. So even if those renewable energy credits are paired with renewable energy before they come in, they're still hit with that emissions factor. So yeah, it definitely would impact that number and reduce it. If you look at the numbers prior to the California specific methodology, when the climate registry was used, the numbers are definitely significantly lower.
Okay, does it achieve lower than the California utility average? As presented on the right here?
I think the California utility average is, it's not really an apples to apples comparison. So it really
The
takes.
chart lends it, the chart lends itself to be comparable, right? I'm looking at the lines in the bar chart here, right? Are they not comparable?
If you, well, go ahead.
Can I speak to this? So the utilities have resources in their portfolio that if they were contracted today, they would be characterized as PCC2 resources, but the utilities signed some of their renewable contracts like before there was an RPS and before the PCC portfolio content category structure existed. And so like I worked at PG&E for a long time. I can rattle off names of their PCC2 projects that are in Oregon, Washington, and used to be in Alberta, Canada. Those resources were grandfathered into counting as if they were a PCC1 resource because the Public Utilities Commission realized, hey, we created this construct of different categories of resources after we approved you to go out and execute these contracts. So the utilities have a few, not a ton, but they have a few resources that count, that are PCC2, but for emissions and RPS purposes, count as if they are PCC1, number one. And then number two, the California utility average includes nuclear energy. And so that does play a significant role in reducing the emissions content of PG&E's portfolio. Does that make sense?
Yeah, not only does it make sense, I've got a follow-up, which is, okay, so I'm gonna ask it a slightly different way. If the Bright Choice has PCC2s, which get an arbitrary allocation because it's emissions in a different state that we don't get a count here at EBCE or in California. If we were to internally, because I know it's not for external reporting, but if we were to internally look at that, do we beat the California industry average?
I don't think that we have an answer to that. I'm not sure that we've done that comparison.
Okay, I'm not asking you to, that would be more work, but thank you for letting me know.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I would just add really quick that if you look at the percentage of renewables, I think the short answer to that question is yes. Our renewables percentage, which includes PCC2s, is a comparable number to the 2021 California Power Mix renewables number. Those are two important numbers that our board has said we really want to focus on renewables and large hydroelectric. So I think the complicating factor of why we would need to kind of rerun some numbers is because if you're going to account for nuclear within the mix of California power mix, then yes, there's a little bit more to do to calculate that.
Let me rephrase where I'm going, and maybe I need to learn more offline, and I will take that as a to-do. But if the ultimate goal of EBCE is to reduce emissions overall, call it anywhere in the world emissions, are we doing that compared to the average? That's the question I'm asking.
Yes, very aggressively.
Okay, thank you.
And the other thing I would just add to that is the answer of emissions alone is there's accounting details there that are associated with that. And we have gotten some specific direction from our board to make sure that we're focusing specifically on renewable energy. And so I think that's something we probably want to revisit with the board to sort of talk through what some of that prior direction was to ensure that we're still continued to sort of clarify that question.
Member Eldred, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes, absolutely. So this slide and this topic is one of the most heavily engaged in topics from the CAC, but also from our member constituents. So I am regularly in meetings these days with community organizations, individuals, folks who are really concerned about what's going on, so I can understand their perspective and try and consolidate it a bit. Other CCAs in the state of California are under these exact same reporting requirements. System power is treated the same way. And while we do well in the renewable comparison, our where we sit on our emissions as calculated by pounds CO2 equivalent emissions is really poor. And so the charts that I've been presented with, which I will go through and do all the diligence on, but the sourcing is pretty solid, show us performing significantly more poorly than other CCAs and other IOUs in California who are subject to the same requirements. So when we're actually measuring emissions factors, it does not appear that we are aggressively reducing overall CO2 emissions. Can you help
Absolutely.
understand that?
So there are a few different factors at play. Izzy spoke to the fact that EBCE elected not to take the nuclear allocation from PG&E. So we are paying, our customers are paying and not getting the emission. That is correct. So we are paying and not getting the emissions reduction credit of nuclear energy that is going on the grid. That is a contributing factor. And other CCAs that have not taken the nuclear allocation are not committed to selling their Bright Choice comparable product at a discount to PG&E. So when we weigh emissions reductions and having a more affordable program for customers to to participate in, we've chosen to maintain affordability as equally important to our over time emissions reductions goals. And because we are choosing to maintain the discount to PG&E, we have not committed to always having emissions that are necessarily less on an annual basis. Although we have committed and have gotten board guidance to have a higher renewable energy target.
Okay, so there are lots of CCAs who do not take the nuclear and have more favorable pounds of CO2 equivalents than we do. I haven't looked at their cost association, but I'll do that before the CEC meeting. So it is the feeling of staff that the other CCAs who do not take nuclear and have better emissions factors than we do are more expensive than PG&E.
Or I would say are not committed to offering their Bright Choice comparable product at a discount.
Okay. Thank you. That gives me some good direction to look for. Most of the folks haven't taken nuclear, and many of the throughout the state don't have those either. So that hasn't been a big factor, especially with the percentages with all of the charts that I've looked at.
Any other questions before we continue?
Yes, Maria, I have a question. So I appreciate the engagement in this topic. It is one that we've been challenged with trying to figure out for a while. So I don't expect a response right now. I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but at a later date, could staff get back to us on what do we need to do as a body to improve the emissions reduction with like a 5% buffer? I didn't hear this spelled out, but my understanding is we don't get PG&E's figures until we don't know what they're doing, right? We can't forecast them. So we're kind of at a disadvantage there. So like I'm saying, I don't expect a response right now, but I do feel we need to figure this out as a body. It's a core principle to us initially starting the CCA in the East Bay. So that is an ask. I don't expect by the next meeting. I know that agenda has to be produced on Friday, but maybe for our April meeting, just to kind of present this body some options. And I will add that I am open to looking at, since our reserves are healthy, if we have to tap into that to pursue opportunities to make that more in line with what our initial mission was, is what I've been hearing for months in terms of the direction I think we need to go. And I'm happy to hear anyone chime in if they disagree, but just trying to kind of summarize what I'm hearing from everyone.
Thank you for the question. I've noted it, and we'll get back to you on this. And I just want to make sure that I have noted the right name. Is that member Kavanaugh? I just can't see in the room at all.
No, it's Marquez, Chair Marquez.
Oh, Chair Marquez, thank you very much.
It's okay, sorry.
I'd like to recommend that we continue with the presentation. We have a couple significant sections coming up.
Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Next slide. That was actually my last slide, so I can pass it to Chris.
Good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to talk about how we think about building our clean portfolio. Let's go to the next slide here. So here's a hypothetical chart to show load coverage. And this is not indicative of our actual portfolio. It's more just a hypothetical situation to illustrate the point. If we look on the left side there, that's megawatt hours. So the blue line is our hypothetical load curve for January 15th of 24. And then we have a few different resources that stack up the bar chart there to kind of fill that position. And again, this is hypothetical. We don't have any geothermal in our portfolio now or in 24. But in any case, it's, this is what a January could look like. Next one, please. If we look at this chart, so this is for what July could look like. The change notably here is that the load curve has changed. So typically in July and in kind of the Q3 of every year, temperatures get hotter. So the load curve changes, gets bigger, gets higher. But also the resources typically generate more. So namely solar. It's typically sunny. It's not raining in California usually during July. And so we get a lot of solar production. And conversely, we also typically get a little bit more wind production as well, as the wind is typically driven off of the uneven heating and cooling of the earth there. So these are two different kind of hypothetical situations where we can look at to illustrate how we would start to kind of fill these gaps and fill this kind of position with a number of different resources. Next, please. So this whole process is kind of generally thought of as falling under the integrated resource planning process, the IRP. So every 2 years, we are required to submit an IRP to the CPUC to show that as a load serving entity, EBCE is thinking about procuring resources to meet our load, but also that we are abiding by the compliance requirements that are set forth by both the state, the jurisdictional authorities, to make sure that we are selecting resources that will meet those goals, but also that we're selecting resources that will meet EBC's own internal goals. So to do that, we have to first think about our demand forecast. So this is where the demand forecasting kind of comes into play a little bit here. I know there's been just some discussion about electrification. How does that kind of play into our longer term picture? So it all comes down to load forecasting. Where do we think our load is going to be with our current jurisdictions that we have under communities that are being served, as well as where we think different programs are going to take us, whether that be demand response, energy efficiency, electrification. Those all kind of boil down into a demand forecast to create these blue lines for every day for the next, call it 20 years or so during the study period. Along with that, then gets folded in the RPS requirements. So we have the state requirements underlying kind of our conforming portfolio, but then we also have another portfolio that has our own internal goals, which has that at a higher percentage than what the state is requiring. Along with that is then resource adequacy. So we have to show that we are maintaining reliability within the state. So those get folded in there. And then we start to look at the market dynamics and kind of the risk assessment of where we think both our positions will be. And so the market, as Jim mentioned before, there's a day ahead market. So as part of this process, we end up simulating or forecasting hourly prices, day ahead prices for the next 20 years. And that's what heavily drives the decisions that go into this analysis to say, okay, well, this is how much kind of money we think these resources will make versus the costs associated with building those. And that ultimately drives kind of the decisions underpinning these models, which is trying to be able to reduce costs while meeting compliance requirements. And then along with that, the risk of that is, well, do we think these will actually perform? Will they actually kind of keep EBC financially stable? But also with variable resources such as solar and wind, bringing back up to this whole PCC kind of topic, is that the production of those variable resources then could mean that we have less kind of PCCs in our pool. So that's another risk that we have to associate. So there's the financial risk, and there's also kind of the production kind of compliance risk that goes along with that. And in order to do that, we come up with kind of a bunch of different hedging strategies on how we will fill that position. And I'll go over those further down in the section here. Next slide, please. So the next step is to kind of prioritize these different inputs or prioritize these different kind of requirements to meeting this here. And compliance requirements are definitely paramount. Those are, we have to meet those. If we don't meet certain requirements, such as our RPS requirements, there's heavy penalties that could be assessed. So that's, an underlying requirement that we have to meet. But also, the board has given us guidance and approved, and we've also kind of committed to the community as part of being a CCA, is that we want to be, more and more cleaner in the future. So we want to make sure that those are key goals. And then we're trying to fit a portfolio that helps get us there with, the most affordable costs and the most kind of the reduced amount of risk. And then there's any other goals that we might have, again, around kind of local programs, energy efficiency, pushing a heavy electrification agenda, and whether we think, Tesla is going to take over the world and kind of electrify all of, the vehicles within California or fleets. Those types of goals kind of get formulated into numerical values and input into this modeling framework. Once that's done, there's the valuation piece. I touched on this forward curve kind of a little bit. That's the forecasting or simulation of forward hourly prices for the next 10, 20 years, depending on the study period that we're looking at. And it comes up with a value for each potential location for each of these projects that could potentially be in there. And as part of this, we don't typically look at specific projects. So we don't say, oh, this developer has this project in this location. It's more generic than that. We're looking at, okay, there are wind projects in this general region, and they generally have a specific cost to them. Or there's solar in this general region, and they have a specific cost with that. And that's where it gets optimized into a solution where it has the best mix of resources based on those there. And then there's other inputs that go into it, such as our current open positions. So how much of our load is currently covered? So in those two hypotheticals, the open load would be the difference between the bars and then the load line. Different kind of credit terms, worthiness about different counterparties. Not all counterparties are credit rated. So some of them have different kind of attributes that we can throw on there depending on whether they have that or not. And then again, there's, just a whole host of other kind of project specific risks, such as new technologies. They may not have been proven. So the risk of them actually getting built or fully realized may be more so than, say, a solar or a wind that's been, around for decades. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but I think this kind of encapsulates the two different pieces of what EBC as a load serving entity has to think about when we are doing analysis such as this. So if we were a pure merchant and all we had were supply resources, we would only have to think about one side of this kind of chart here. But since we are also the ones that are scheduling our load, trying to meet our load, our customers' load, we have to think about both sides of this. So it just adds another layer of complexity, but also, gives us the ability to help kind of shape our own future there. A lot of this I touched on before, but then there's some other things that kind of go into here. So, there's the fuel prices that, I'm sure there's, probably been news out there that individuals have seen about natural gas prices, gasoline prices, a number of different fuels that kind of go into these things. There's plant retirements. So natural gas plants coming offline, coal plants coming offline. Eventually, whenever Diablo ends up going offline, those types of things get rolled up into this analysis. And then, a number of different policies kind of get thrown into there. And ultimately, this is sort of like an iterative process where we continually add in different pieces and see how that shifts sort of the ultimate outcome of these different portfolios. So we have one that we have to conform to as part of the CPUC process, but then we get the kind of latitude to come up with our preferred, which is again giving a portfolio that meets the needs of what we as EBC are trying to accomplish, as opposed to what the CPUC says we have to. So that being, greater percentage of RPS, 0% carbon free, those types of things. Next, please. So graphically, how do we think about that? We define the eligible products that can fill these bars, that can kind of fill to the load line here. And namely, if we look at these two graphs, it starts to give kind of an interesting picture of where our future kind of open position is. The open positions in both of these two hypothetical examples are in hours where solar is not prevalent. Typically, solar doesn't generate in the middle of the night, which is where these circles are showing. So then we have to think about products that start to fill in those gaps. And if we look at the wind kind of is almost an inverse of solar typically, not perfectly, but typically, which can help there. There's base load generation, such as geothermal, that can start to help fill in some of those gaps. There is storage, so either standalone storage, or we can pair it with a different generation resource to be able to shift that generation that otherwise would have made our portfolio, quote unquote, go long during the middle of the day. As well as there's potentially other new technologies that are out there that we're evaluating. I should also point out that, for example, for wind is also locationally specific. So for example, New Mexico wind does not generate at the same times and in the same quantities as, say, California wind or as Wyoming wind, or as in the next 10 years or so, we'll call it 10 years, offshore wind. They all have different profiles that lend themselves to either helping our portfolio or potentially making it more risky. So those are the different kind of products that we have to think about those. And this is how we think about hedging, is to say, well, we have an open position. What best product fits into there? And that's a mix of a number of different things that can get us to that solution. Next, please. So we can fill our open position. In this case, this is just another hypothetical instance here. This is our currently unhedged portion, is the from the tops of the bars to the load line. And how can we think about doing that? There's fixed price energy hedges, and I'll talk about that in just a minute here. Additional generation resources, I touched on a number of them. There's a whole host of other ones, such as biomass, biogas, geothermal, some other interesting storage technologies that are out there. And then there's dispatchable kind of energy storage, which is really, I think that'll be kind of key when we're trying to think about how do we take all this excess solar that we may have during the middle of the day and push it to hours where we really need it, such as over the peaks or kind of in that early morning time frame. Next, please. I wanted to throw this in here because I think this is also enlightening to show what's going on with wind and solar as we add more and more to the grid. So this is a chart that the California ISO put out about the curtailment that occurs by month starting back in 2014 when they first started publishing this. And curtailments are when there is generation expected to happen or scheduled to happen and it gets cut, whether that either means it's cut completely or cut partially. Any of that is considered a curtailment. And curtailments typically occur when there is an economic impetus, so prices that come out of the California ISO for a given hour or hours dictate that it is not needed on the grid. There's too much solar or wind occurring that it makes an economic indicator to say the grid just does not have the demand to meet the supply that is being generated there. And that typically enables wind turbines to back down or solar facilities to stop generating to the grid. And as we get closer and closer in time here to the kind of end of 2022, which is on the bottom right there, the curtailments just keep going up and up and up. And this chart will probably continue to tick up in the future as we increase the amount of renewables that are on the grid, because we're not increasing load during the middle of the day, which is typically when solar is the highest. And the load when the wind is the highest hasn't fully caught up either. I think the main thing that will kind of clamp down the amount of curtailments that occur is again pairing storage with these generating resources to be able to say, okay, instead of curtailing, I'm just going to charge a battery, and then I can use that energy later on in the evening, the next morning, whenever is most appropriate for the portfolio.
Can we pause for 1 second,
Yes.
Chris, and take member Eldred's question? And I want to be mindful that we are getting a little bit tight on time.
Sure.
This is a quick one. This is a really shocking slide. And I'm wondering if we are doing any active work around seeking flexible load and things like that that can help offset the costs and like bring down the cost of the renewables that we have online if this kind of curtailment is happening. That can be addressed at a different time.
Yes, flexible load is functionally people using less electricity. And so it's demand response programs. And we do seek to purchase demand response and develop our own EBCE internal demand response. And it's hard to get people to really be responsive to not using as much electricity on an ongoing basis. So we're never going to see like huge numbers of enrollment in demand response programs because, we all want electricity when it's hot and when it's cold.
I'll just note that we do have various other programs beyond demand response, looking at EV charging, other building electrification programs. They are small in scale, but they build over time, and it's an area that we're investing staff resources and time to certainly, try to bring more flexibility along for this very reason, of course.
Exactly, and to make sure that we're developing EV programs that incentivize charging at the right times, like in the middle of the day when it's sunny. Chris, please continue.
Sure. Yeah, and actually increasing load during the middle of the day is actually a program that would decrease the amount of curtailments, perhaps, because that's kind of they're the inverse of when occurs there. Next slide, please. So then we go out to market. EBC has issued 3 requests for offers out to the market to identify counterparties that have product or projects that they can submit to us and we can evaluate. We end up doing a evaluation process to determine if those fit into our portfolio, do a negotiation process, and then ultimately execute the agreements, bring them to the board for approval and have them sign on the dotted line. Next. So I think this has been touched on a few different times, a few different places, but we'll just reiterate it again. These are the priorities that we as EBC have. Grid reliability, I think, is a key piece there. There's a lot of challenges with increasing renewables on the grid because of, again, sort of the inverse nature to load to supply there. But the resource adequacy that we have, bringing on new incremental resources, bringing on resources that are dispatchable or flexible to any extent. That helps with the grid reliability piece there. There's the customer commitments that we have. So the RECs and carbon free that Izzy was mentioning there, as well as the RPS program, making sure that we're being compliant with the RPS as well as the RA. And then being, financially prudent, such that we have, reserves to be able to manage this and manage the cash that we have there with both physical and financial hedges. So all those kind of come together to be, the main priorities of really what the power resources team kind of encompasses. Next, please. And then here's kind of the role, I want to touch on this, the specific roles of the different hedge products that EBCE engages in. Jim mentioned the CAISO market before, and that's where all of our generation and all of our load goes into. So every day we submit our load into the CAISO market to settle, as well as submitting our supply resources, and those settle in both the day ahead and the real-time market. So that's where we both buy our load, but that's also where we sell our supply. And that's a form of a hedge. So that's, part of being, for example, if we were completely unhedged, all of our load would be bought in the CAISO market as opposed to being covered by some of these other products. And while we don't do that, there is a portion of our load that does go to the day ahead market. And that's part of our policy, our hedging policy there. Then there's the power purchase agreements. So PPAs, those are the ones that we bring to the board for approval. There's a number of different ones that different iterations that we both have done or have contemplated. There's both physical and financial. I think the difference between the two is that with a physical contract or a physical power purchase agreement, there's a physical resource that is behind it, and we typically get attributes from that, whether that be RECs or RA there. Whereas with a financial, there's typically just a kind of a contract for differences. We're settling financially, so we don't get any of the actual energy that comes from the facility. There's no emissions that come with it. It is just a financial transaction back and forth, dollars and cents there. And then going back to the physical, then there's also RA only transactions. There's also REC only transactions. And then there's a whole bunch of other different flavors that kind of go along with that.
Chris, can I just add one clarification?
Sure.
I think it's important for the board to understand that a financial transaction can be used to fill in those empty circles that we saw a few slides ago of, hey, what are the products that we can use to fill in the gaps between supply and demand? And so while a financial transaction isn't energy being delivered to EBCE specifically, when EBCE executes a financial transaction, we make sure that there's a physical resource backing the transaction so that energy is being delivered to the grid. And so there is reliability that comes along with it. And functionally, it serves to close the gap between our supply and demand. So it actually does contribute in that way without us, EBCE, taking possession of the electricity or any emissions that go along with that electricity.
Yeah, we can think of it as just, we can think of it as another block in those charts to fill towards the load position there. And then the last product or products is forwards and futures contracts. So this is blocked products, shaped products, options. We haven't done any options, but there's possibility out there. Import RA, as well as financial exchange traded futures. All of those different products that we have or different hedging options that we have allow us to have greater diversity of different resources, greater diversity of counterparty risk, greater just diversity in how we have options to be able to fill those circles, as Marie mentioned. All of these different pieces are needed to be able to create an optimal portfolio that reaches our end goal there. That is the last slide that I have, and with that, I can turn it back over to Jim to finish out the presentation. Oh, sorry, I had one more. Sorry, forgot about that. This is just a sample week from our latest kind of our IRP study that was done here. This just shows less hypothetical situations. These are actual like simulated situations for our portfolio here in a sample week in 2030. So 7 years from now, this is what could possibly happen. And in this example, it's just showing that there are two days in this sample week in which the portfolio is long, meaning that we have too many resources and not enough load and or storage capabilities to shift the power around. And it kind of, highlights and illustrates that in order to reach our kind of our RPS and carbon free goals, that we have to have a lot of solar on our portfolio, but that there will be instances in which our portfolio goes quote unquote long and we sell that excess generation into the California ISO market to be able to allow those to occur, to meet the goals that we're reaching there. So this is just kind of a sample week from April and July from our IRP study. Now to Jim. Sorry, I had one more. I will very quickly touch on this. Risk management, I have touched on a number of these already, but these are a lot of the ones that we have to think about with PPA specifically. So change in law, the length of contract, making sure that there's diversity of there. Force majeure, that's an interesting one, whether it be from something environmental, something like an act of nature, those types of things. Credit, the volume, the performance of them, all of these different things encompass the risk management when we are evaluating contracts before we finish negotiating them and bringing them to the board. There you go.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll take it from here. So, again, we talked about the broader market and some of the products that EBC purchases. Now we're going to talk about, what I think is kind of fun stuff, which is, steel in the ground projects, getting renewable projects built in our territory and in state. I'm going to talk about some of the specifics of that. Next slide, please. And I'm also going to try to keep us on time to make sure there's time for questions. So if I skip stuff here, feel free to ask me after the fact and I could fill in some of the blanks. So again, we talk about long-term contracts. And so these are typically for projects. Sometimes they are for products off of other projects, but ultimately the takeaway is that it's something being built or something that's recently built, and it's something that has a product that is of value to EBCE. And so here on the slide here, it's kind of showing the life cycle of how EBC interacts in our long-term contracts. And so Chris discussed our request for offers, our RFOs. That's typically the way that we evaluate long-term projects. Again, new build, renewable projects. And so we'll put this out there and we'll receive from sellers a bunch of different project types and variations for those projects. And EBCE will evaluate that and make decisions based on how the products offered fit within our needs, and then how the financials line up to current market conditions. The market is extremely dynamic over time. And so we want to find something that fits within our portfolio, but also is representative of what we feel like the market is. And so we find a project we like, or hopefully more than one, and then we work to negotiate the power purchase agreement, the PPA. And so this is a very long document that defines the terms and conditions that the seller, the person building the project, and the buyer will operate under, and then the boundaries for the product that we're actually buying. And so we bring this agreement to our board, and both the buyer and seller sign this agreement. At that point, we're now in a partnership with the seller and the developer for the project. And so we talk about kind of project life cycle. There's get the PPA executed, and then there's a big phase of time where this thing is being built. And then we get to a period in time that's called commercial operation date, COD for short. This is a period of time that the project has been built and that a bunch of boxes within the agreement have been checked. And there's a lot of steps that the developer needs to do to certify that the facility is operational. And there's a bunch of steps that the CalISO has to do to determine that the facility is ready to generate and provide power on the grid. Those things are like the permitting to build, building the facility, checking all the boxes they need, the state and local level, what they need to be able to get the thing actual built and erected. So then we get to the operation date. The thing is online, and then we move into post-operation, which is the online period of time. So the project's been built, it's online, we've reached COD, the project's now online. And now EBCE's role in that is to monitor performance. And so this large agreement has certain specifics that the project has to operate under. I think, for instance, we contract for 100,000 megawatt hours of solar. And so we are watching the performance of the asset after it's online to ensure that it reaches the milestones and fulfills the obligation that we as EBC and our customers have paid for. And so this online period goes on for the delivery term of the project. And that's typically 10, 15, or 20 years after the commercial operation date. And then after that period of time, we reach contract execution. And at that point, EBCE and the seller would separate the relationship most of the time, and then return any funds that are matched, but also maintain our relationship with the data we had for purposes of reporting and auditing. And that goes on for some subsequent years at the end of the delivery term. Next slide, please. So building a project is not easy. Putting a large solar farm in the desert isn't easy. Building wind turbines somewhere isn't easy. None of the stuff is without its challenges. And so the stuff on this slide is basically some of the things that can happen when you run into in the different phases of developing these long-term assets. So again, we're building something new. There's challenges in the developer getting the appropriate permits to take a swath of desert land and make it solar panels, or to put turbines on a hillside. There's challenges with the ability to interconnect the project. And so what that means is that the generation asset is plugged into the grid, and there needs to be considerations that the CalISO must make, and that the transmission owner, PG&E up here for us, must make to make sure that when the energy flows, it's not going to break anything, and that it's reasonable enough in the design of the grid. And then during the delivery term, so now we've reached COD and the project's online, there's impacts of weather on solar. There's the variation that we get year over, as we all know it, in weather, and there's changes in wind patterns that can affect the performance of the asset relative to the terms of the agreement that we deal to. And so we're monitoring that to make sure that they're able to reach the benchmarks that we have defined within our agreement. And then, as Chris pointed out, there's curtailments. So there's impacts on the grid, relation to under or oversupply, that can require the CalISO to say, hey, turn off the power here. We can't have you run right now. And that's a consideration that we're always aware of during the delivery term. And then there's outages. The unit has planned outage schedules when maintenance needs to be done. But then there's also conditions where there's equipment failure and an outage might be forced. An inverter goes down on a solar farm and they have to stop operation. And when that happens, we need to coordinate both with the ISO, the California ISO, and also with our scheduling coordinator to know that we are fulfilling our obligation for grid reliability when these projects go down. And then there's the financial component too. We have an expectation when we evaluate these projects, they're going to have a certain amount of revenue come in for the energy that they're selling onto the grid as part of the CalISO market. Changes to the grid over time, we talk about a 10, 15, 20-year delivery term, can impact that analysis and make a project more or less valuable for either the buyer or the seller. And so we need to work to kind of mitigate those challenges. And then there's congestion. If you have a bunch of projects located together, that creates a condition where the project's energy value may go down because there's already enough power on the line in kind of a regional area. And again, so just, it's hard to get these things built. It's hard to operate them when they're going to. Next slide. And finally, all of our projects that are executed. I think there's 12 on here, but I counted it a while ago. So this is just a list of stuff that is online and stuff that's being built and stuff that hasn't begun to be built yet, but that we have executed agreements for. We see some of our favorites on here, Schweck over there in Altamont, some of the stuff that, we brought on already. And we see some of our near-term projects. Tulare Solar is our most recent, and Clearway Daggett would be probably the next one online in August of this year. The stuff's on our website, so I'm not going to go over each project, but this is the current list of executed agreements. Next slide. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions? We have about 4 minutes for questions because we do still have some other items on the agenda. Do we have any hands up?
There's no public comment at this time.
Okay, any questions from directors? Just want to make sure everyone has a chance.
There are no hands raised
Okay.
at this time.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the procurement team. That was extremely comprehensive. We really appreciate the deck, putting all this information together. Thank you so much. I just want to acknowledge there were some questions from our members in the beginning. So if staff, if there's not capacity to maybe do a brief overview at our next board meeting, just to kind of contextualize and give people some information and resources. If that's all possible, that would be wonderful. I am going to move on to item number 5 and just want to give everyone a welcoming remark to the new members. Sorry that we started a little bit late and delayed, but I'm trying to get used to driving to meetings. Traffic does not cooperate. So thank you everyone for your patience. It is my goal to get us done by 2, but we have a couple items. I did want to just say happy International Women's Day to everyone on this board, as well as our staff. You are valued and appreciated. Thank you to the mothers, the aunts, the tias, the grandmothers, everyone that makes this world go around. So I want to acknowledge that. I also want to state that the ad hoc compensation committee is still meeting. That committee consists of myself, Vice Chair Bulge, Member Patino, and Member Dan Kelb. We will more than likely be holding off on bringing that to closed session. We're still trying to firm up some details. As everyone knows, this board is under a huge transition with many new members, so please be patient with us. We will do our best to bring everyone up to speed, but there is a lot of moving parts. I just wanted to give everyone that brief update. Before we adjourn, we also have to swear in another member, our alternate member from Emeryville. Welcome. And before we do another oath of office, can we just verify that there's no one else that needs to take the oath of office?
Everyone else has taken the oath of office.
Okay, so if you don't mind, we do have to do the oath of office. We're trying to streamline and get as many things together.
Thank you. Yes, right hand. I, your name,
I, Siddhi Clark,
do solemnly swear
solemnly swear
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State.
and the Constitution of the State of California.
That I take this obligation freely,
I take this obligation freely,
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
without any mental reservation or confusion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I'm about to enter.
that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations, and again, welcome to all the new members. And our next meeting is going to be on March 15th at 6 p.m. And physical location will be where we're currently at. And those of you that are going to participate remotely, I believe I've already provided the clerk their address to note on the agenda, correct? We have that information.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And if see no other business, this meeting is adjourned at 1:56 p.m. Thank you, everyone.